Anarchism and Socialism by Georgy Valentinovich Plekhanov. Chapter 2: The Point of View of Scientific Socialism. The great idealistic philosophers of Germany, Schelling and Hegel, understood the insufficiency of the human nature point of view. Hegel, in his philosophy of history, makes fun of the utopian bourgeoisie in search of the best of constitutions. German idealism conceived history as a process subject to law, and sought the motive power of the historical movement outside the nature of man. This was a great step towards the truth. But the idealists saw this motive power in the absolute idea, in the Weltgeist. And as their absolute idea was only an abstraction of our process of thinking in their philosophical speculation upon history, they reintroduced the old love of the materialist philosophers, human nature, but dressed in robes worthy of the respectable and austere society of German thinkers. Drive nature out the door, she flies in at the window. Despite the great services rendered to social science by the German idealists, the great problem of that science, its essential problem, was no more solved in the time of the German idealists than in the time of the French materialists. What is this hidden force that causes the historic movement of humanity? No one knew anything about it. In this field there was nothing to go upon save a few isolated observations, more or less accurate, more or less ingenious, sometimes indeed very accurate and ingenious, but always disjointed and always incomplete. That social science at last emerged from this no thoroughfare, it owes to Karl Marx. According to Marx, legal relations, like forms of state, can neither be understood in themselves nor from the so-called general development of the human mind, but are rather rooted in those material conditions of life whose totality Hegel, following the English and the French of the 18th century, summed up under the name of bourgeois society. This is almost the same as Guizot meant when he said that political constitutions had their roots in the condition of property. But while for Guizot the condition of property remained a mystery which he vainly sought to elucidate with the help of reflections upon human nature, for Marx this condition had nothing mysterious. It is determined by the condition of the productive forces at the disposal of a given society. The anatomy of bourgeois society is to be sought in political economy. But Marx himself shall formulate his own conception of history. In the social production of their lives, men enter upon certain definite, necessary relations, relations independent of their will, relations of production that correspond with definite degrees of development of their material productive forces. The totality of these relations of production constitute the economic structure of society, the true basis from which arises a juridical and political superstructure to which definite social forms of consciousness correspond. The mode of production of material life determines the social, political, and intellectual processes of life. It is not the consciousness of mankind that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. In a certain stage of their development, the material forces of production of society come into contradiction with the existing relations of production, or, which is only a juridical expression for the same thing, with the relations of property within which they had hitherto moved. From forms for the development of these forces of production, they are transformed into their fetters. We then enter upon an epoch of social revolution. This completely materialist conception of history is one of the greatest discoveries of our century, so rich in scientific discoveries. Thanks to it alone, sociology has at last and forever escaped from the vicious circle in which it had, until then, turned. Thanks to it alone, this science now possesses a foundation as solid as natural science. The revolution made by Marx in social science may be compared with that made by Copernicus in astronomy. In fact, before Copernicus, it was believed that the Earth remained stationary, while the sun turned round it. The Polish genius demonstrated that what occurred was the exact contrary. And so, up to the time of Marx, the point of view taken by social science was that of human nature, and it was from this point of view that men attempted to explain the historical movement of humanity. To this, the point of view of the German genius is diametrically opposed. While man, in order to maintain his existence, acts upon nature outside himself, he alters his own nature. The action of man upon the nature outside himself presupposes certain instruments, certain means of production. According to the character of their means of production, men enter into certain relations within the process of production, since this process is a social one, and, according to their relations in this social process of production, their habits, their sentiments, their desires, their methods of thought and of action, in a word, their nature, vary. Thus it is not human nature which explains the historical movement. It is the historical movement which fashions diversely human nature. But if this is so, what is the value of all the more or less laborious, more or less ingenious inquiries into perfect legislation and the best of possible social organizations? None. Literally none. They can but bear witness to the lack of scientific education and those who pursue them. Their day is gone forever. With this old point of view of human nature must disappear the utopias of every shade and color. The great revolutionary party of our day, the International Social Democracy, is based not upon some new conception of human nature, nor upon any abstract principle, but upon a scientifically demonstrable economic necessity. And herein lies the real strength of this party, making it as invincible as the economic necessity itself. The means of production and exchange, on whose foundation the bourgeoisie built itself up, were generated in feudal society. At a certain stage in the development of these means of production and exchange, the conditions under which feudal society produced and exchanged, the feudal organization of agriculture and manufacturing industry, in one word, the feudal relations of property became no longer compatible with the already developed productive forces. They became so many fetters. They had to be burst asunder. They were burst asunder. Into their place stepped free competition, accompanied by a social and political constitution adapted to it, and by the economical and political sway of the bourgeois class. A similar movement is going on before our very eyes. Modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld whom he has called up by his spells. For many a decade past, the history of industry and commerce is but the history of the revolt of modern productive forces against the property relations that are the conditions for the existence of the bourgeoisie and its rule. It is enough to mention the commercial crises that by their periodical return put on its trial, each time more threateningly, the existence of the entire bourgeois society. The weapons with which the bourgeoisie felled feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself. The bourgeoisie destroyed the feudal conditions of property. The proletariat will put an end to the bourgeois conditions of property. Between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie a struggle, an implacable war, a war to the knife, is as inevitable as, was in its way, the struggle between the bourgeoisie and the privileged estates. But every class war is a political war. In order to do away with the feudal society, the bourgeoisie had to seize upon political power. In order to do away with capitalist society, the proletariat must do the same. Its political task is therefore traced out for it beforehand by the force of events themselves and not by any abstract consideration. It is a remarkable fact that it is only since Karl Marx that socialism has taken its stand upon the class war. The utopian socialists had no notion, even an inexact one, of it, and in this they lagged behind their contemporary theorists of the bourgeoisie, who understood very well the historical significance, at any rate, of the struggle of the Third Estate against the nobles. If every new conception of human nature seemed to supply very definite indications as to the organization of the society of the future, scientific socialism is very chary of such speculations. The structure of society depends upon the conditions of its productive forces. What these conditions will be when the proletariat is in power, we do not know. We do know but one thing, that the productive forces already at the disposal of civilized humanity imperatively demand the socialization and systemized organization of the means of production. This is enough to prevent our being led astray in our struggle against the reactionary mass. The communists, therefore, are practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country. Theoretically, they have over the great mass of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. These words, written in 1848, are today incorrect only in one sense. They speak of the working class parties independent of the Communist Party. There is today no working class party which does not more or less closely follow the flag of scientific socialism, or, as it was called in the manifesto, communism. Once again, then, the point of view of the utopian socialists, as indeed of all social science of their time, was human nature, or some abstract principle deriving from this idea. The point of view of the social science, of the socialism of our time, is that of economic reality, and of the immanent laws of its evolution. It is easy, therefore, to form an idea of the impression made upon modern socialists by the arguments of the bourgeois theorists who sing ceaselessly the same old song of the incompatibility of human nature and communism. It is as though one would wage war upon the Darwinians with arms drawn from the scientific arsenal of Cuvier's time. And a most noteworthy fact is that the evolutionists, like Herbert Spencer, themselves are not above piping to the same tune. And now let us see what relation there may be between modern socialism and what is called anarchism.